Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's local government education program. This is provided by University of Illinois Extension. My name is Ann Silvis and I serve as a program leader for community and economic development for University of Illinois Extension. For sound quality, we're going to mute your microphones during the presentation. If you have any problems connecting or getting the audio, add those questions to the chat space and we'll watch that during the presentation. I'll also watch that for your questions and make sure that our presenters see your questions, and we'll probably have questions at the end of the program. We'll record today's webinar, and that recording will be available on our local government education website and YouTube channel. And everyone who's registered will receive the slides and the links to the resources and also the recording for today's webinar. So today we have Counting for Dollars, Census 2020. Joining us as presenters are Elisa Johnson. She's from the U.S. Regional Census Bureau. Carrie Davis, Democracy Program Director at the Joyce Foundation, and Anita Banerjee, who leads the Democracy Initiative Census 2020 for Forefront. So thank you to our three presenters and welcome.
Thank you so much, Ann. Again, this is Elisa Johnson. I'm the Assistant Regional Census Manager for the Chicago region. We are an 8-state region, and our main headquarters for the 2020 census is actually located in downtown Chicago. We have a number of offices around the 8-state region, but our main hub, again, is located in downtown Chicago. Next slide, please. As everyone knows, we have now approached the 2020 census. We recognize at the Chicago region that we have a major task ahead of us. And of course, the Census Bureau has been around. The decennial census was first taken in 1790, and it is part of our constitutional mandate that we conduct the census every 10 years. And so it's important. We all know that it's important. There's a lot at stake, over $600 billion at stake in federal dollars, congressional seats. And so we take that mandate very seriously here in the Chicago region. And history has shown for our region that we've been very successful at conducting the census, and we recognize there's challenges this time around. And so that constitutional mandate becomes even more critical for what's at stake, not only for our 8-state region, but across the country. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, we are an 8-state region. I think oh, okay, thank you. And so most residents are familiar with the decennial census, which takes place every 10 years. We do have a host of surveys that we are continuously conducting over the course of the 10-year period. One of our major surveys, of course, is the American Community Survey, which used to be considered the long form of the decennial census, but now we conduct the American Community Survey, which touches about 250,000 households every month, somewhere close to close to 3 million households every year. And so we've been getting phone calls right now from different congressional offices where individuals are still receiving the American Community Survey. That survey will continue throughout the decennial. That particular survey is truly where we receive most of our rich demographic data. So we've had a lot of phone calls from individuals wanting to know, is this a legitimate survey? Will the survey stand down during the decennial? So that survey will continue to move forward. We also conduct what's called the economic census, which again provides us with some of our most important business data. That particular survey is conducted every 2 years, years ending in even numbers. And so we will be conducting that survey as well next year. So those are just 3 of our most significant surveys. But as I mentioned, we have the health survey, the crime survey. And so at any particular time, we can be conducting over 30 surveys every month. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are an 8-state region with Illinois, really the central state in the region. We have a huge task in front of us for 2020. Prior to the 2010 census, we were a 3-state region, which consisted of Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. But post the 2010 census, the regions all realigned across the country, and so we took on 5 additional states. We have over 52 million people that we have to enumerate, and over 23 million households. And so we recognize that within those numbers, we have some really significant challenges ahead of us. Next slide. And so for 2020, there's a lot has changed since 2010. And I'm just going to go through this as quick as I can, but just starting where to establish, where we establish where we need to count. And so that's really important as we started on this journey for the 2020 census back in 2016, understanding where some of the challenges are. And one of the first operations that we delved into, of course, was the addresses. We know that the mailing addresses, of course, is the foundation for a complete and accurate census. And so we started early re-examining how we could retool how we verify addresses. And so we've been working very closely with the Postal Service to make sure that we have accurate addresses. We also have a very robust geography program with 3 or 4 top important geography programs that we have been working with our local governments on. And we also obtain addresses through satellite imagery. And so these are significant changes for us to make sure that we're capturing correct addresses. And then as I move up, motivate people to respond. Every decennial, we have a large communications campaign. That has not changed this time around. We have a contract with Young and Rubicam, which is one of the country's largest PR and marketing firms. And so we'll talk a little bit about that a little later, but our program is designed to motivate people to respond. And again, we recognize that we have a lot of challenges ahead. And so we've really taken a deep dive into how do we motivate and how do we continue to motivate the public to respond. So one of the larger differences, for the most significant difference for 2020, is the way people can self-respond. Typically, households all receive the census questionnaire. Of course, for 2020, we have now moved into an electronic phase of the census where people can actually self-respond via the telephone and the internet and by paper. And so that's significantly different. We want people to be able to respond no matter where they are. They can pick up the phone and respond. They can go to a public library to self-respond. And so that's pretty significant in terms of how we've been educating the public. And then moving on to group quarters, that's the operation where we actually enumerate large facilities, group homes, colleges and universities, correctional facilities, service-based enumeration facilities. And so that particular program has not changed. It is a cornerstone of how we actually conduct the census when it comes to places where there are a large number of residents. And then moving to the non-response follow-up, our goal in Chicago is to make sure that people are self-responding in the first phase of the census, that they're self-responding. But if not, if they don't respond via the internet, cell phone, or by mail, then we move into what we call the non-response follow-up, where we begin to send our employees out to knock on doors. And then following that process, we begin to close down the full 2020 operation. And we move into the tabulation of the numbers. We have to deliver the numbers to the president by December of 2020, and then we have to deliver the redistricting numbers by the end of March of 2021. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about non-response follow-up and group quarters. But one of the operations that's really important, we just, last year, or in 2018, we began to open up some of our census offices. I mentioned that the downtown office is the main hub for all of our operations. However, we have additional 40 plus offices that we began to open up in 2019. So just kind of following the path of the timeline. So right now we're opening up those additional 40 plus offices. And then we just wrapped up, moving to the center of the timeline, we just wrapped up our first major operation, which was address canvassing, where we actually sent out thousands of employees to verify remaining addresses from our master address file that needed to be updated and verified. And so that operation actually started in August, and we wrapped that up on October the 4th. Our region actually closed out our address canvassing on time and on schedule. And then we just recently finished up on October the 11th, the quality assurances for the address canvassing operation. So then as we begin to move into January, that's our peak enumeration. We do have some areas in the Chicago region where we have non-traditional mailboxes. And so we have an operation actually called update enumerate and update leave in those areas that are non-traditional, where we actually go to the door and enumerate, or either we go to the door and leave the census form. So that process starts around January, it moves into March as well. And then in February, we start the group quarters operation, and that's when we actually go in and start enumerating the colleges and universities. And so that's a very important operation because of the number of colleges and universities that we have throughout the 8-state region. And then, as I mentioned, we move into the non-response follow-up period. Once we come out of the self-response period. And forgive me, I skipped right over the middle. It's not showing up on my screen, Nancy, but April 1st is, of course, Census Day, the most important day for the 2020 census. Those households that have not responded by April 1st, then we move into the non-response follow-up period. And then, of course, at the end of December, we deliver the numbers. Next slide. We talked a little bit about how we collect the addresses. I also mentioned that we have a very robust geography program. I know a lot of our local governments participated in the vast majority of our geography programs. We know, again, that geography is the basis for a complete count. Without the accurate addresses, we can't have an accurate census count. So again, we've partnered with the U.S. Postal Service, our boundary and annexation program, where we partner with the local government so that they can provide us with any information in terms of changes in their community boundaries, and if there's any annexation or de-annexation for that matter, if any of that has occurred. I talked a little bit about address canvassing. We just finished that operation up. And then the local update of census addresses, that is one of our main geography program where we partner with the local governments so that they can verify the addresses that we have on our database and they can add to it. We had a very aggressive campaign to make sure that our local governments were involved in the LUCA program. And then, of course, we have new construction. It's important for us to make sure that we are aware of any new construction that has taken place throughout our communities. We do have over 21,000 governmental units in our region. That's really significant. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to reach out to those 21,000 plus local elected officials and communities. Next slide. I won't go too far into address canvassing. As I mentioned, we just finished up address canvassing where we've sent out thousands of employees to knock on doors to verify our master address file. And so, again, infill canvassing is a little bit different this time around based on the fact that we have partnerships with the post office, local governments, and by use of satellite imagery, we were able to reduce actually the number of employees that we actually put in the field because we were able to capture a little over 60% of our addresses through those other mechanisms that I just mentioned. Next slide. And then group quarters, again, one of our most important operations in terms of enumerating college residence halls, group quarters, prisons, nursing homes, and residential treatment centers. This operation actually kicks off again in February. We're working with the colleges and universities right now in terms of how they prefer. There are 4 different mechanisms that a university can actually select to enumerate their college students. And so there are 4 ways, and we've been working with the colleges and universities to make sure that that we are aware of how they have selected to enumerate their students. So our challenge through a lot of our partners is to educate residents and also the students that if they are away at college, that they are to be enumerated where they actually reside on April the 1st. Very important. We get a lot of questions around prisons and where those populations will fall. And of course, those populations belong to wherever those individuals are enumerated. So we get a lot of questions around that. Next slide. And then the homelessness, those individuals who are experiencing homelessness, we have staff right now that's actually working to collect locations, addresses for all of our service-based enumeration locations throughout the 8-state region. We also have what we call the non-shelter outdoor locations, our Census program, where we'll be working for 2 nights identifying and enumerating those individuals, again, who are experiencing homelessness. Our staff is working diligently with the local officials through what we call our complete count committees to make sure we have those areas identified where individuals tend to sleep. On the tinsel night, we will deploy staff to those areas to enumerate those individuals who may be sleeping in non-traditional locations. So that the Census program is very key right now. Our region and our staff has been working very aggressively to make sure that we have a full list of where the service-based enumerations, the service-based facilities are, as well as the non-shelter outdoor locations. So we've been working here in the region for about a year now, just really trying to identify so that when those operations kick off at the top of the year, that we'll have a full list of identified places where we need to send staff to enumerate. Next slide. And then, of course, the non-response follow-up period. Again, we want to make sure that when the census forms hit the mail early next year, and when the households begin to receive their letter invite, that they can self-respond. We want to make sure that that our region, that we're on the ground working, educating early, so that when we move into non-response follow-up, we don't have to put as many staff or what we call listers on the ground, because if we have a very successful self-respond period, then that will mean that we'll have to employ less individuals to put on the streets to start knocking on doors. During the non-response follow-up period, which again will take place actually at the 1st of May, we'll start preparing in April. And then May 1st, we'll deploy our staff to start knocking on doors. They can have up to 6 attempts to reach a household. That could be via a knock on the door, a letter, a postcard, a telephone call. And so they are allowed to go back up to 6 times to encourage the household to respond. And again, that operation starts in May and it shuts down in July of next year. And so when will the Census Bureau start mailing? So next year, around March the 12th, through the 20th. An invitation to respond online will be sent to 95% of our households. I say 95% because there are certain areas that we recognize that are without traditional mailboxes, or some households actually have to use P.O. boxes. So in those areas, we recognize that we'll either have to go knock on the door to enumerate, or we actually have to go to the household and leave the form. So that's why we say that 95% of the households will actually receive that invitation to respond online. And then those households who have not responded, March the 16th to the 24th, will receive a reminder letter to encourage them to respond. And then we send out a series of actual reminders, March the 26th to April the 3rd. We send out another reminder postcard. And then those households who absolutely have not responded, by April the 8th, will receive a reminder letter, plus we will send out a paper questionnaire at that point. And then April, oh, thank you. And then this is just a sample of what the questionnaire looks like. We are stressing that that it is safe, confidential, of course. Our staff were all sworn under oath. There are penalties for confidentiality, which is very, very key. We have to maintain that level of confidentiality under Title 13, that the information that's provided in the questionnaire is safe, and we stress that to our partners. It's quick, it's easy, and so we're really trying to make sure that we're pushing the sample form out so that individuals can actually see what the form will detail, and so we can make sure that you guys have those sample copies if you're in need of those. Next slide, please. Census communication, next slide. So one of the things that the Census Bureau was involved in early on in the early beginnings of the preparing for the 2020 census, there have been many focus groups and surveys that have gone out to the public to just start to have a full understanding of some of the fears, some of the concerns. How do we best motivate the public in terms of encouraging them to respond to the census? And so one of our surveys is actually called the Census Barriers Attitude and Motivator Survey. We call it the CBAMS. And this survey, along with focus groups, was sent out to over 50,000 households, just so we could gain some understanding of what are some of the attitudes, what are some of our barriers to a complete count. And we also conducted a number of focus groups in and around the 8-state region. We had focus groups for minority communities, for the socially mobile population, which is those individuals ages 18 to 24, which is a very unique population. And that particular population brings a whole host of challenges in terms of how fast they move around, how they like to receive their information, in terms of being educated of the importance of the census. And so these surveys really provided us with a lot of detail in terms of how do we create our communications campaign, how do we push out the messaging. And one of the focus groups that I sat in on, which was the social mobile, it was very interesting to hear how that age group prefers to receive information through YouTube and social media. And so we were really able to reshape some of our commercials and things like that based on these surveys and some of the focus groups. Next survey. I'm sorry, next slide, please. And then our integrated partnership and communications campaign. I'm actually over the partnership program for the region. This is a little bit different going into 2020. We are really we're taking a really deep dive into how do we educate and motivate people to self-respond. And so along with headquarters, our headquarters, which is located in Suitland, Maryland, and regional staff, we were able to come up with this model in terms of how do we really dig down or reach down into the hard to count communities. And so this is just a model of some of the pieces that we've been able to come up with, really re-engineering our public relations, our crisis communication. There are things that are out there in the universe that we have to be able to build, messaging around to make sure that we're able to shore up some of those falsehoods that are out there in terms of the census. Our statistics in the school program, which again is one of our cornerstone projects that never go away. We know that children, particularly in those households where we have language barriers, tend to send messages home to their parents. So we're really relying on our stats in the school program. We've got a very robust data dissemination team that understands the data. So these are just some of the areas that we are employing in terms of really building out our communication strategy. Social media is new this time around. So how do we use that? So we're building out those platforms now. Next slide, please. And then in terms of where we are in the process, these are our phases of our communications campaign. When we're out working with our partners, it's important for the partners to kind of know where we are in the phase in terms of our communications campaign. We started early in our region. We actually started in 2017 with developing our early strategies to educate the public. We have really been ahead of the country in terms of building out that plan and what does that plan need to look like for our 8 states. And then, so that phase actually wraps up at the end of this year. And then we move into our awareness phase, which is January 20th through 2020 through February. And again, our communications campaign with Young and Rubicam will begin to flow out. The commercials, the advertisement, those things will begin to flow out. The branding will become more prominent beginning in January 2020. And then, of course, we move into the motivational phase, and we're really leaning on our partners to really help us continue to motivate and encourage the public to self-respond during that period. And then the reminder phase, which is May the 20th, 2020 through July 2020. Again, we're trying to remind the public that please self-respond, and that's when our non-response follow-up period kicks off. And then, of course, in late next year, we move into our thank you phase, where we'll begin to thank our partners for being a part of the 2020 census. And then January 2021, our data dissemination phase will start, where we'll start pushing out the data to the public. Next slide. The languages this time around, we have 13 languages that individuals can self-respond in. That's English, Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Russia, Arabic, Tagalog, Polish, French, Haitian, Creole, Portuguese, and Japanese. So we get a lot of questions about how did we come up with these 13 languages. A lot of the data is driven by the American Community Survey data. The language that we were able to obtain through the American Community Survey really provided the basis for how those languages were selected. We do have an additional 59 language guides and other languages that individuals can actually utilize to help them self-respond over the phone or with the assistance of some of our partners, community-based organizations, some of our service providers. Next slide. And then, of course, the Chicago Regional Partnership Program. Currently, right now, we have over 200 partnership specialists working on the ground. Hopefully, some of you all on the call have been contacted by some of your local partnership specialists. The specialists are designed to reach into the community and encourage local governments, community-based organizations to really get involved in the census. And so we've been very fortunate here in Chicago. We got an early start. All of our states have signed on. As you can see on this map, all of the states in blue are the states that have signed on to have what we call a complete count committee or a commission, where the governors have appointed a liaison and who and built out a committee designed to help educate all levels of the state. And so we got an early start. We worked with all of our governors. We had face-to-face meetings with all of our 8 governors, even including the new incoming governors in the states of Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin and Minnesota. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of movement at the governor's level. Next slide. And then, of course, our partnership specialists, they've been out working with the local mayors and elected officials on the county level, the city level, the township level. We've got a large rural geography in our 8-state region. So they've been in and out of all those communities, really trying to educate and encourage and engage our partners on the ground so that they can also educate and engage residents on the ground as well. So our program has actually got started in late 2016, and we've been working ever since. Next slide. One of the things that we have highlighted in our region, we know that we have over 21,000 governmental units, and again, we have over 54 million individuals we have to enumerate. And so we've really taken a very deep dive into where are the low response score tracks, where are those communities where we absolutely know that we have to reach. And so this map is just a demonstration of our staff has been working in what we call the low response score tracks, those tracks where we know 20% or greater of the population in those tracks traditionally will not respond to a survey, where there are language barriers, where we know that there are children ages 0 to 5 in some of those tracks. Children tend to be undercounted during the census. And so if you drill down through our system, our tracking system, you can see actually what is the demographic makeup of that track that's causing it to be what we call a low response score track. And so this is just an example of what our teams are equipped with when they go out to determine their workload. Like, where are some of the really hot areas that we need to deploy staff and really start developing those relationships. So this is something that we've been working on for quite some time. Next slide. Census recruiting. This time around, we've got an extremely low unemployment rate across the Midwest. We have really been feeling the impacts of the low unemployment rate. Although we know that it's low, we also know that there are communities where residents really need to be employed. And so we're encouraging through this system. In 2010, it was an application system where you can actually, but now for 2020, the whole process is online, and it's basically an assessment. At the top, you can see some of the sample questions. How quickly do you adapt to new things? So it's not necessarily the traditional job application as opposed to an assessment process. So this is the process that individuals will go through in order to apply for employment with the Census Bureau. One of the things that I do need to mention is that right now we have recruiting goals. Our staff has been out actually recruiting. We just finished hiring staff for our early address canvassing, but we continue to recruit so that in January we can actually start hiring from our recruiting pool. So our recruiting goals for the Chicago region is over 360,000 people that we have to recruit, not hire, but recruit for our operations that will start in January. And so we've been leaning on our partners to really help us through their infrastructure to help us promote our jobs. Our staff has been doing presentations with our local elected officials, some of the libraries, places where we know that will be significant in helping us with some exposure for the jobs that are available. Next slide, please. And then Census Data. So our ROAM tool, our low response score mapping tool, is available for the public. These are just some of the tools that are available. if you're interested in knowing how your community responded to the 2010 census, we do have our 2010 male participation rate map. We also have the Roam tool, which is the tool that our staff utilizes to track those low response score tracks across the region. So they really lean into this tool so that they can know where their workload needs to be and what are some of the demographics and some of those tracks that we know that we're going to have some issues with. So these are just some of the tools you can see in the Chicago region. We had states that had some of the highest participation rates for 2010. Wisconsin came in first, Minnesota was second, Iowa and Indiana came in third, Illinois was 11, and of course, right now there's a little bit of competition going on between some of the states in terms of who's going to land number one. We just want to make sure that the region continues to tick upwards in terms of how residents are responding. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. I am available for questions.
Thanks, Elisa. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carrie Davis. I'm with the Joyce Foundation based in Chicago. And building off of what Elisa said, I'm going to share a little bit about the National Census Counts Coalition effort that is designed to complement the Census Bureau's work and to highlight some key resources that have been produced by the coalition that may be useful to you and your organizations in your local census engagement work. And I'm going to try to speed through this quickly. I want to flag that there will not only will you be sent the slides, but I have a resources handout that you're going to get as well. So some of the resources I refer to are going to be listed there, so you don't have to scramble to write down URLs for any of these. Next slide, please. And this is just about the Joyce Foundation. Next slide. So most of you already know this already, but I always like to make sure that we start off with a shared understanding of how the census data is utilized and how it impacts our community's well-being. And 3 points I like to stress and certainly encourage you to use this as you're doing your outreach. First is just the reach of this. Accurate census data impacts communities we serve in a variety of ways, from distribution of federal funds and services, to allocation of political power through reapportionment, to even private sector decision-making about where to open or close businesses. And there are several good resources in the resource list handout you'll be sent that have concrete examples of these that you can use in your outreach. And as Elisa stressed, the Census Bureau wants our partnership. The regional Census Bureau staff are eager to work with public and private sector partners at the state and local level. And we're really fortunate here in Illinois that we've got a fantastic regional office and a really strong partnership amongst the public and private sectors to do census outreach. So we can really take advantage of that. Next slide, please. So the Census Counts Coalition is a national network of nonprofit and philanthropic partners that have mobilized to support 2020 census outreach. You can find it at the coalition at censuscounts.org. These groups work together with the Census Bureau and state and local government, and our focus really is to engage hard-to-count communities and encourage them to fill out the census. And the coalition here is trying to fill gaps, such as providing outreach in additional languages beyond the ones that were covered by the Bureau, as well as raising awareness in communities that are either unfamiliar with the census or in communities where distrust of government is high. So for example, we have a lot of groups that work with immigrant communities because there's a concern right now after heightened immigration enforcement that they may hesitate to engage with government officials. So we want to make sure that we're doing outreach at the community level with trusted messengers. And that's what the coalition effort endeavors to do. And Anita will be talking in a few minutes about the local effort. Next slide, please. So the National Census Counts effort is being led by a coalition of what we're calling hub groups that have developed specific outreach strategy and materials that focus on populations that we know are hard to count and that have been disproportionately undercounted in previous censuses. So we have data from 2010 and 2000 and before that indicate what populations tend to be harder to count. These are communities of color, immigrant populations, communities where English may not be the first language, maybe the second or third. Also low-income communities, populations that move frequently, and the biggest hard-to-count group is actually young children. The 2010 census missed in the neighborhood of 2 million children under age 5 because people forget to count the babies. So that's another area that we're focusing on in making sure that we're doing outreach. And really building key support amongst partners as well, such as faith leaders and the business community. So all of these groups that you see listed are really engaged in this broad coalition effort. Next slide, please. So here are some of the key resources that have been developed by the Census Counts Coalition that are being made available to partners across the country for their efforts. So first, if you go to censuscounts.org, you'll see along the toolbar across the top a resources section. This includes a wealth of materials that have been developed by these hub groups. There are fact sheets and FAQs that answer basic questions about, how does the census work? What questions will the census ask and not ask? How to identify census workers as opposed to others. It'll include information answering questions about the citizenship question that was proposed, but ultimately removed and will not be on the census. It includes, there are some fact sheets that talk about Title 13, the law Elisa mentioned, that has the privacy and confidentiality protections that's been translated into additional languages, as well as some webinars and training materials. So for example, there's a whole battery of trainings related to doing digital organizing and digital outreach that's available. There are recorded webinars and more. One of the resources is a briefing series on message testing. So a lot of these hub groups conducted intensive message research within the populations they serve to better understand how certain hard-to-count groups perceive the census, if they're aware of it, if they understand it, and what concerns they have about filling it out, but also what motivates them to get them to respond. And what was fascinating is the top motivator across all demographic groups is understanding that the census impacts resources that come into your community and they're used by your family. That was the biggest motivator. But all of those message testing results and recordings of webinars are available at the link there. It'll be on your handout as well. And groups like Asian Americans Advancing Justice and NALEO and others have developed materials that are tailored to specific communities and that are available in additional languages. So this is a great resource. There's also a webinar series on census operations. The coalition has put this together in partnership with the Census Bureau, and it looks at key aspects of the timeline Elisa was describing, different aspects of how the census is conducted. So that's a great resource. I encourage you to take some time and look at these, as there may be tools there that you'll be able to use in your local efforts. Next slide, please. We're also going to highlight some additional partner resources and tools. The first one I want to highlight for those of you who haven't seen it yet is the hard to count map. This was developed by the folks at CUNY, and it helps show really a visual so you can see where different hard to count populations live. You can zoom in at the state level, by county, by zip code, even by legislative districts, to see the criteria locally of what hard to count populations are in those areas. And you can see the toolbar on the left has information about hard to count communities and how to search. This is the national view. Next slide, please. So this is where the state level view. So if you zoom in by state, this shows the view for the state of Illinois. And as you click on different jurisdictions, that information panel lists what types of hard to count groups live in that area. It also includes what the self-response rate was in 2010, so you can see what that number is. And it even, as you continue to scroll down on that page, it also even shows internet availability. So Lisa mentioned the Bureau is encouraging people to fill it out online. They also have the option to do it by phone or by mail. But for areas that have low internet usage at home, we need to do extra outreach in those communities. Some places are setting up census kiosks so that there's internet availability for populations who may not have it, or encouraging those residents to respond using one of the other methods. But this HTC map, hard to count map, is incredibly helpful just to understand where the hard to count populations are in your area so you can tailor your outreach efforts accordingly. Next slide, please. Another helpful resource is the Counting for Dollars report, and this was developed by George Washington University. There's a link to it in the materials you'll be sent. And this report, the first version of it, looks at the 55 biggest federal spending programs that are tied to census data, either in whole or in part. And in total, these 55 programs account for over $800 billion in federal funds over 10 years. And they also have this breakdown by state and by county so that you can see your specific numbers. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the top portion of the two-page fact sheet for Illinois. And again, the website address is in your materials. And the fact sheet that was developed for Illinois identifies that there is over $34 billion of funds that come into our state as a result of census. So the stakes are really high for us to get this right because there's so much funding and so many resources tied to this. Most recently, GW has also come up with county level fact sheets. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot of one portion of those. And it looks at county level funding for 5 key programs. One of those are Title I education grants. Second one is looking at community development block grants. And then a third category are Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act grants related to youth activities, adult activities, or dislocated worker programs. So if you want to zoom in and see how much money your county gets from just these 5 programs related to census, it really drives home the importance of doing community level outreach because we see how much is at stake. Next slide, please. There are also resources that have been developed for local government. The National League of Cities has produced a toolkit with a municipal action guide to help local jurisdictions prepare for census. And I always like to stress that, while this is written for local governments, the guide's also incredibly informative and helpful for community organizations to understand the local impact of an accurate census count, how that data is used, not just in terms of dollars, but things like where to open a new fire station, where to open a new senior center or community center, how services are planned. One jurisdiction I talked to mentioned that having accurate census data helped them when they needed to get FEMA relief after they were declared a disaster. There's so many local uses for census data, and this guide is a really great tool to help you plan. Another one I want to highlight is from the American Libraries Association. They are a very strong partner in census work. They have a whole website here with information and resources, including helping to plan for having online response centers, making computers available for folks who don't have them. Next slide. Last piece is just kind of what you can do. We can plan through our complete count committees. We can use our communication channels to promote participation. And third, take advantage of partnership opportunities, which Anita will talk about next. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to Elisa and Carrie for your very informative presentations. I'll take it local and I'll try to be brief. Next slide. So the census is important for 3 main reasons in Illinois. Okay, so really quickly, Forefront, the organization that I work for, is a statewide organization. I lead the Democracy Initiative, And I just want to really quickly show on this slide how we break up our work and how the census is all consuming, that we actually had to break it up into a separate component. So we're a membership organization for grant makers and nonprofits, and we're looking to really utilize our entire sector when we think about these trusted messengers to help Illinois get a fair and accurate count. Next slide. So the census is important in Illinois for three main reasons, right? The first and foremost being our congressional representation. This is what our congressional map looks like today, with 18 congressional districts. And it's important to note that since 1950, Illinois has lost one congressional seat in every census cycle. So we used to have 24 members of Congress in 1950. We're now down to 18. And keeping with that trend, next slide, we're likely going to lose one, right? And where would that one seat come from? Many are surmising it would come from the central and southernmost part of our state. So you can imagine that with losing one seat, this is what our congressional map could look like. But understanding that we've had considerable outward migration in the last 5 years alone, there's a real concern that if we don't have a fair and accurate count, we could very likely, next slide, lose a second. And where would that second seat come from? Could very much come from the greater Chicago area. So certainly looking at the map, right, this is what it could look like if we were to lose 2 congressional seats. So this is very much a statewide issue. Next slide. The second reason why the census is so important is because of our federal dollars, right? Every 10 years, we need to have a count in every state to determine the federal dollars that come to that state for the next decade ahead. So Carrie already mentioned this really great tool, right? The hard to count mapping tool that helps us determine where these various hard to count populations are, that then will help us to determine how much money we can get coming to our state. But I'd really encourage you, if you haven't looked at this map already, to drill down, because you can print a congressional district, a state elected district, a county district by your specific district, and it'll print out in the various shades where those various hard to count populations are demographically as well as geographically. And we need to be mindful of geography, in particular to the 2020 census, because with the census going online for the first time, we know that rural communities will be much harder to account for. Next slide. So this body of work Carrie also mentioned is really great resource to be able to drill in to find out how much money is at stake for any designated state. As Carrie mentioned, we get about more than $34 billion annually for 55 social service programs. That's a lot of money. That's more than $200 billion over the course of the next decade. And when we know that our state budget is always in flux, right, we need to ensure that we get those federal dollars. Next slide. So what does this kind of look like when you think about per person, right? According to the Andrew Raymer study, that comes out to about $1,800 a person, but for just 1 year. So over the course of a decade, that's $18,000 that one person represents that a state misses out on when they go unaccounted for. And when we think about children 0 to 5 being a very big hard to count population, that's a lot of money, a lot of resources that states have missed out on in the last census, through the last census and over the course of the last decade. So for Illinois, this comes out to about roughly $1,400 a person. So that's $14,000 over the course of the next decade that one person alone represents. Next slide. And the third reason why the census is so important, and this is the one that isn't always as reactionary, it's more thinking long-term and thinking ahead, is that we need to plan for a better tomorrow. We need to incentivize for Illinois to keep its population, not have its population leave our state. But we can't do that without fair and accurate data, right? We need to know where we need to build the new roads, infrastructure, so that we can have better pathways across the regional Census Bureau states, right? We need to know where new hospitals, new schools, ESL programs need to be provided for. And that goes even deeper into community when you think about small businesses and where should small businesses continue to grow, right? All of that is presented on census data. Next slide. So how do we get an accurate count, right? We need our trusted messengers with effective messages, and we need for that to be local. Next slide. So these are the two national efforts that Forefront focuses on that Carrie already mentioned, right? The first one being the Census Counts, right, website, and it's censuscounts.org. I would really encourage you to look into this website because it's chock full of information. It mentions it mentions all of the webinars and the series that Carrie mentioned, but it also has customizable graphics, social media posts, things that you can very easily take, add your logo to, and be able to share far and wide. The other one is the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. This national group has a table that's all things census, and it's called Funders Census Initiative. This website will take you to even more information. So you might find that a little overwhelming, I understand. And so what Forefront has done is we've taken a compilation of information from both of these websites to help form our own. Next slide. So Illinois, for the last year and a half, had 3 main statewide tables with a 4th one that was created this summer. We want to quickly walk you through those 3 statewide tables that you can take, that you can get invested in and take information from to help customize your work moving forward. So the first is the Illinois Complete Count Commission. It's made up of 22 members from across the state, census ambassadors, that if they are from your region, certainly look to them to help you as you put together census town halls or briefings. They could very well be that spokesperson. They've got a website that's got information that's also provided for in a variety of languages. They meet monthly and their meetings are open to the public. It is facilitated through the Secretary of State's office. The second 2 tables are from are what create Forefront's Illinois Count Me in 2020 program. So we have a statewide advocacy coalition with 4 working groups. Our 4th group is our Get Out the Count work, and that's made up of our grantees that were funded through this 3rd table, the Illinois Count Me in 2020 Funders Collaborative. This collaborative was important because as we were looking to ask the state and the various counties and cities for money to provide for capacity dollars, we knew that we also had to ask philanthropy to step up and provide necessary dollars so that organizations could do this work boots on the ground. So we engaged early and we were able to get an RFP out in January. We received about 80 applications from across the state, and now we have 42 organizations that are already entrenched in this work and have been through since the spring of this year. That list of organizations so that you can tap in, as necessary is provided for on the Advocacy Coalition website. And that if you look at in the middle section at the very bottom, IL Count Me in 2020 is that website. We've got a calendar full of events that are occurring across the state. We've got various webinars that have been provided for nationally, resources that are really, really important and helpful as we do this work stronger and smarter together, not harder. And then finally, it is the compilation of information from the Funders Census Initiative and the Census Counts website. Next slide. So in the midst of all of this great work that started last year with those 3 statewide tables, we were very fortunate that the governor of Illinois and the Illinois General Assembly worked with various advocates from the Forefront Census Coalition as well as the Rainbow Push Census Coalition to help provide for a state appropriation that it came about at the end of this legislative cycle. There were two bills that had been in state legislature, one that had asked for the state for 25 million and the other that had asked for 33 million. I know, a lot of money, but we are one of 3 states with the most to lose in the 2020 census. And the governor's office, particularly their policy team, understood that huge ramification of not being able to provide for a better tomorrow if we don't make an investment today. So in May, the General Assembly appropriated $29 million for an outreach effort, which also established a 4th statewide table, which is the Illinois Census Office housed at the Illinois Department of Human Services. I would really encourage you to go to their website. They've got a stakeholder newsletter to sign on to that will keep you abreast and up to date of information that will be coming forth through that office. They've got 2 statewide co-coordinators that you can connect with. They will be charged with working collaboratively with philanthropy, with stakeholders, and of course the Regional Census Bureau, so that we continue to do this work in collaboration. The other group that is part of this effort in the 4th table is a statewide census advisory panel. This is kind of an advisory group of state legislators and 2 members of philanthropy that meet monthly to help make sure that this state's work is staying on track. Next slide. So that's it in a nutshell. I know that this was a lot of information, and certainly I am available, as are Elisa and Carrie, for future questions down the road, since if we can't address everything today. Thank you.
Thanks to our 3 presenters. Wow, that was a lot of information, but thanks to Elisa and Carrie and Anita, you've given us a lot to think about. I want to let everyone know that the PowerPoint, the recording, and then the reference materials that were mentioned will all be available to you later after we get that recording uploaded to the website. So Nancy's going to put up a poll. So as we think about questions, take a minute and respond to that poll. There were a couple questions asked early on that I think you guys actually answered. One question that Diane asked that wasn't addressed: is there a way to see the official paper form now to understand the wording of the question on residents? Our residents are often traveling until April 1, but live the greater part of the year in our county. Will they be able to mark their permanent location? And if you have to get off the call because it's 1 o'clock, go ahead, but we'll stay on for a few more minutes and answer questions. So I don't know if that's a question for you, Elisa, about looking at the paper form now, because you won't be in your home around April 1st.
So the residency rules explain that you are to enumerate where you live the majority of the year. So we recognize that we have people that may have summer homes. You know, we've got snowbirds or sunbirds. You know, we have military individuals. So the residency rules say that you enumerate where you live the majority of the year. So those rules in writing as well.
Okay.
I hope that answered the question. So
yeah, I think it's a question about people who happen to be residents during.
So we always tell people, I mean, you self-respond where you live on April 1st. But for those individuals where there may be 2 households, the residency rules clearly identify that you self-enumerate where you live the majority of the year.
Another question, and maybe Elisa, this is for you as well. Are there penalties for not completing the census form?
So there are. So we're not a policing agency. So I want to be very clear about that. There are fines and penalties for not responding to the census. But again, you know, we're not a policing agency. even though the rules do tell us that that there are stiff penalties and potential penalties if you don't respond. But again, we try to through our partnerships, the voices, we really try to relay to our residents that that the importance of them responding. So. Again, but we don't try to venture into that area because, again, we're not a policing agency.
Okay. There's another question about if a city is still annexing properties, when is the last date to get those addresses submitted to the census to be included in this year's count or this census count?
So if I can find out where that question is, who provides that question, I can put them in touch with our geography staff, and they can walk through the deadlines for those all the geography programs, annexation, the LUCA program. The LUCA program is actually right now have begun to release to the local governments those addresses that that we do not accept. So we're actually in that phase right now. So, and then the new construction program. So all of those programs have deadlines associated with them. So, but I would love to know who the question came from so that we can circle back.
Okay. We'll see if we can follow up with that, Elisa.
Okay.
And then there was another comment about the Illinois general primary election, which will be March 17th, 2020. And there'll be numerous campaign mailings sent at the same time as the census mailing. So if someone doesn't get their census mailing, or maybe this question is sensing a worry that that might get tossed out with all the other stuff that comes at that time, where can they come?
Okay, so they can visit our website, www.census.gov. And so we have a whole landing page for the decennial, the 2020 decennial. So there are 1-800 numbers located on the website. There, we also have our regional phone number, the Chicago regional phone number into operations, and also the partnership side if people have questions about whether or not they received a census form or not. So we understand that we're going to a general election as well. So we know that there's going to be a lot of movement in terms of the general election and local elections too around that time. So we're very sensitive to that. And so that's why we're really building up a lot of partners on the ground so that we can kind of work through some of those issues related to the large mailings that will take place around that time from candidates running from office. So,
okay, thank you, Elisa. Another question: will the invitation and reminder letters have a unique code for residents to use to go online to complete their form?
Yes, and so if we've also received questions if you misplace your letter, you can still go on and self-respond via your address because those actual codes are geocoded by address. So we've had some concerns from people who say, hey, what if I lose my letter? You can always go online and self-respond via your mailing address.
Okay. What was that last? Oh, there was one question: how much effort is being exerted to gather citizenship data, and how will that data be used?
So on the American Community Survey, there is a question about citizenship on regarding the citizenship question before the 2020 decennial. That question will not be a part of the actual decennial form. But we do recognize that we do utilize administrative records to help us. That's so on that chart that I showed at the very beginning, how do we establish where to count? And so part of our gathering of complete addresses, we do use administrative records for making sure that we have accurate addresses. And so this question seems to be, on the heels of the citizenship question not being placed on the actual 2020 form. We've been getting that question a lot in terms of we would be using administrative records to assist along the way in terms of making sure we have information for households. So we will, during our quality check process, we have a post-enumeration survey that we do at the end of the census. We also have our quality controls and quality checks in terms of trying to reconcile any duplication, things like that, where we will use administrative records for our quality check. But in terms of determining citizenship for the decennial, we're not, utilizing, we as the individuals responsible for the operation and the actual deployment of the census, we will not be going down that avenue in terms of using administrative records for
If I could
citizenship.
jump in, if I could
Sure.
add, this is Carrie. The census, I'm sure you're all aware there was a lawsuit over potentially adding a citizenship question to the 2020 census form. The Supreme Court said no. The administration said they weren't going to pursue that anymore, but there was an executive order issued by the president urging the Bureau to collect other administrative data relating to citizenship and immigration status. There is a live lawsuit right now challenging that executive order. So we're waiting to see how that plays out in the federal courts in terms of potentially gathering other data. But as Elisa already stressed, Title 13 protections in terms of privacy law say that the Census Bureau cannot release individually identifiable information. So there are still those privacy protections in place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that additional information. One last question. Any idea when we can see what the postcard will look like and review the online process of filing?
So I'm actually at our headquarters today working, and we have had a lot of requests for a sample of the postcard as well as the internet instrument. So I'm really hoping to leave here today. We've had a lot of questions regarding what will the internet instrument look like. So I can certainly, if I'm able to get my hands on that, we can, I'll be more than happy to share that out. So.
Thank you. We'll look forward to that. So it's past time. So I just want to again thank Elisa Johnson from the U.S. Regional Census Bureau, Carrie Davis, Democracy Program Director at the Joyce Foundation, and Anita Banerjee, who leads the Democracy Initiative, Census 2020 for Forefront. It's been so helpful to have you three here today. Lots of information and more to come, I'm sure. Before you leave us, I just want to remind folks that on Thursday, November 14th at noon, we'll have our next webinar, Minimum Wage in Illinois. And our presenters are Dr. Robert Bruno and Frank Manza IV. They co-authored a book, Raising the Minimum Wage, what a $10, $13, or $15 per hour would mean for Illinois. That is promising to be a very interesting and timely webinar. So don't forget to join us on Thursday, November 14th. Thanks everyone for your attention. We appreciate our three presenters, and goodbye.